Dear colleagues, students, and all participants, both in person and online, I welcome you on behalf of the research group in Physics and Astronomy Education. Today's talk culminates a series of seminars we have organized this year with an outstanding speaker. We are indeed honored to host Professor Carl Wieman, known to all of you as one of the recipients of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Physics. For over 20 years, Professor Wieman has devoted his expertise and research efforts to improving the teaching and learning of physics in higher education. Making rigorous use of evidence-based methods, his research group has investigated the effectiveness of active learning strategies in improving students' understanding of physics. In today's seminar, titled Learning to Think Like a Physicist and How to Teach It, Professor Wieman will show how expertise in physics can be developed by practicing decision-making when solving authentic problems. He will explain how to carry out this practice in physics undergraduate courses and discuss the research that underpins this approach. So as I hand over to Professor Wieman, please join me in welcoming him to our department. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Today it's a pleasure to speak to you. So my talk today, as I say, is learning to think like a physicist. Some parts of it are talked from the perspective of students. Other parts are sort of targeted more towards physics teachers, but I think you'll see that all of it is kind of directly relevant to both teachers and students. So the way I'm going to organize this today is first kind of go over the basic, what I see as the relevant educational goal, what we mean by thinking like a physicist, and then give you some research-based, what research tells us about learning this kind of thinking, this kind of expertise, and then go into applying these principles in the learning settings of both carrying out physics research as a graduate student and also in physics courses. And then I'll finish with some examples of applying these in a variety of different kinds of courses. So I'll start with, okay, the educational goal here is having students learn to think like a good physicist. But what does that actually mean in detail? Well, what I'm going to claim is that it really means being able to solve problems, particularly novel real-world problems, like a skilled physicist, using the knowledge and reasoning of physics to solve these kinds of problems. And this is really what being a physicist is about. Now, obviously, people aren't going to immediately know how to do this, and so, but the progression of this kind of expertise is something that takes place over a long period of time, so they're at least beginning to do this in introductory classes as students are just developing this skill, and then as they get more advanced up to graduate school, et cetera, they're at a much more sophisticated level. But the basic goal is still always the same, of this learning to be a good problem solver. But, okay, so that's the goal, but how does one actually learn to do this? Well, the way it's usually taught, physics problem solving, is much like teaching people to swim by throwing them in the deep end of the pool and seeing if they can do it or not. Students are given some problem to solve. If they do it, good. If they fail, well, they're given some other problem to keep trying at it until they're being successful. But that's not, and sometimes they're given some hints or series of steps to follow, but these don't really seem to be all that useful. And this process is just not very efficient. And so how does one do better? How does one make this learning of problem solving a more efficient process for work for more students? And so what I'm going to go into is some principles from research really on how to best learn and teach this. And this starts with the research been done on really the development of expertise in general. And there's a person, Anders Ericsson, who's done pioneering studies on the development of expertise of all different activities and disciplines, from music to athletics to chess playing and other intellectual activities. And what he's discovered is quite remarkable, that across all these different fields, there's a very similar process required to develop expertise. And he talks, it's a type of practice of the activity that he labels as deliberate practice. And what deliberate practice involves is, first, it's very much not just being told how to do something. So sitting listening to lectures doesn't do it. In fact, he's seen that even routine practice of doing things kind of over and over again that aren't very challenging also doesn't really help. What really helps is you have to have this intense practice that has an intense focus on improving particularly the sub-skills that make up the area of expertise. And so one needs to have the expertise to be learned broken down into small pieces, the sub-skills, and then the learner has to practice intently to master those things, both individually and then as a group, group. And this practice, it has to be working with challenging tasks that really require intense focused effort to achieve that really stretch the learner's capabilities. And he's seen that because of this it's inherently hard work, and so motivation is a critical part to being successful. And in other aspect of this deliberate practice is there needs to be some kind of feedback on as the learner practices, giving them guidance on how to improve and what they need to do while they're still remembering how they do it, what to do to change. And finally, it also takes years of effort, actually, to reach a very high level of expertise in really any subject. And it's becoming really pretty clear now from other areas of research in the brain that this is really sort of a biological requirement, that this intense practice actually changes the brain and develops through rewiring how the neurons are hooked up, basically gives the brain new capabilities. And it just takes a long time and effort for the brain to make that much change. So, okay, so this is deliberate practice that anybody needs to do to become an expert. We want to look at physics problem solving. And so how does one do this for physics problem solving? Well, physics problem solving is a complicated activity. It involves all different sorts of things. And so the biggest question is, what are the individual sub-skills that a person needs to focus on to get better at this? How do you sort of divide up the problem solving into pieces? And this is where the research from my own group comes in. And what I'd argue is there's a specific set of problem-solving decisions that a person needs to learn to be a good physics problem solver. And this comes from work that my research group did, where we looked at a large number of skilled, accomplished scientists and engineers, and we looked at how they solved problems within their discipline and how that process actually played out. And what we found is that across all these different people in all these different fields, their problem-solving process was defined by making a set of decisions. And the thing that was actually most surprising to us was across all these fields, it was the same set of decisions. We identified 29 of them that were used almost, by every one of these experts across their different problems. And so just so that probably sounds pretty bizarre when you just hear it, because you think different kinds of engineering, physics are very different, until you look at what kind of decisions these are. They're things like when you have a new problem, deciding what concepts and mental models are relevant to solve it, what information's needed and what information's relevant for solving the problem, deciding how to find that information, deciding what approximations or simplifications are appropriate, deciding on potential solution methods, and et cetera, down the list. And so once you see the decisions actually framed that way, you can see, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. These apply in many different areas of science. Now, we also look that although the decisions are the same across all these different fields, how one makes the decision or an expert makes a decision in any particular instance, that requires then specialized disciplinary knowledge of the field relevant to that situation. And so the experts always so although they're making the same decisions, to make those decisions, actually, they call upon the specialized information that they've acquired. And I'll just say that all of these decisions are also always made with limited information. If you know everything about the situation, then you just follow a procedure. That's not really a very important part of the problem solving. It's kind of where there's uncertainties and you're sort of making a best educated guess, calling on your experience and the relevant information to make this. This is really what the problem solving process involves. So since we see that practicing and mastering, making these decisions is so important, I'm going to go into more details about what they involve. Here's basically sort of a rough organization of categories that we find that these fall into. There's a couple in the deciding on the importance of the problem and how it fits to the solver's expertise. Then there's some on delineating the goals. Then there's a bunch of decisions involved in framing the problem, number of them involved in planning the solution, number of decisions in the category of collecting and interpreting information, and then a bunch of decisions involved in testing and refining candidate solutions, and then finally a few decisions on deciding on implications and communications of it. Now, although we've roughly laid these out in a sort of chronological order that they'd be followed, in actual fact, as we see with our experts, nobody follows a simple linear procedure like this. They're always getting partway through the problem, they'll be thinking about getting new insights, and they'll be jumping back to earlier steps, earlier decisions in the problem, and making many of these decisions multiple times. Now, just to make sure you really have this list in mind, I'm actually going to, here's the list of the 29 decisions, and I'm just going to give you a minute to read through these on your own. And as you do, I want you to just kind of think in the back of your mind, which of these things you think are the most important and which do you think are the most difficult to learn? And then I might have people volunteer their opinions on this. So now I'll just give you a chance to read for a minute. Okay, so probably most of you had a chance to get through most of them. Does anybody want to volunteer what you think are the most important? Yes.
I think number 29 is the hardest, because if you do well on the others, you almost forget what was happening to start the problem off, and you come back to 29 and you're like, how do you climb out of the rabbit hole of your problem and connect it back to everyone so they can benefit from what you did?
Okay. Other ideas? Yes, over here. I think if you just yell, we can hear.
So I think a combination of number 8 and number 9, because I think it's very important to try to have an idea of what you're looking for, because if you're just doing things without knowing where you want to go, I think it's impossible to progress. I think Feynman did also say that, but yeah.
Okay, so 8 and 9. Any last, one more? Yeah, right here.
To me, the number 10 is a crucial one, because typically if you have a very complex problem, you really want to really reduce the complexity, so it's very important to understand the approximation and simplification. And also 11, because once you being able to subdivide in simple blocks, then it's more tackable, the problem.
Yeah, okay. So all of these are good points, when in fact, when I do this at different audiences, I always get an almost random set of things here. And I think there's an important lesson in that, which is that really all of these are important. At some point, each of one of them becomes essential to do correctly to be really effective at solving a real problem. Now, my own personal opinion, and it's just my opinion based on working with students, is that actually probably the most important and the most difficult might be these reflection decisions, number 23 to 26. And the reason I say that is that they're important because they're the error-correcting decisions. They're the ones in which you re-examine what you're doing and realize some part of it was wrong, the approximation you were making or the plan you had, the approach you had, and then you need to go back and fix it. And so I think they're really important just because of that. But I also think they're the most difficult, and in part, this is just from working with students. We see that people need to reach sort of a higher level of expertise in the subject before they're very good at actually recognizing their errors and recognizing when they need to change their approaches to things. But like I say, those are just my opinion. The main point is to realize that all of these are important. Now, I keep talking about the decisions, but we spend most of our time in teaching thinking about what's the topics we're going to cover, what's the knowledge students need to learn. And so I want to say a little about the role of knowledge. And in our study of these sciences expertise, what we saw is they're always calling, in the making decisions, they're always calling upon their knowledge of the subject. But what we also see is they've really organized their knowledge of the subject around its use for being able to make these kinds of decisions. And this involves, sort of recognizing key features, and they have it sort of organized in mental models that they can sort of run mental experiments to predict what's going to happen and use that to guide their decision making. And this has implications for teaching, because what it means is really the best way to learn knowledge, the most useful way to learn knowledge, is if a person learns it in the context of how that knowledge is to be used, how it can be applied to make decisions and thereby solve problems. And this actually, goes to how one organizes knowledge in the brain, so the learner has it organized around recognize when it will be used. And we see in my group and many others see how students who don't learn this way, then they're just told about various topics, they'll learn it so they can, repeat it as sort of memorized on a test, but then in given authentic problems, they're really bad at recognizing when and how to apply that knowledge. And so that's just, I just emphasize that this is a really important point in both the learning and teaching of thinking how the knowledge you're gaining can be used. So let me just turn now to think about, okay, so you want to learn to think like a good physicist, you need to have this deliberate practice of making problem-solving decisions. And so I'll now focus in on how to do that in the setting of carrying out research like a graduate student would be doing, and also then in course settings. And just a set of important components here to review is you really need to practice the full set of decisions because they're all different, all important. Now, obviously, you're going to have at introductory courses, only a subset of these are going to be relevant. But by the time somebody is getting up to be a PhD student, all of these things are important. And when you're think about as you're a student or a teacher thinking of problems that you're going to have students practice on, it's important that they be challenging, to take a lot of focus and effort, but not impossible, so you really can be successful. And then there needs to be ways to get feedback on how the learner is actually performing. And the importance of this, or the important components of feedback, is it needs to be timely while the learner is still remembering what they're doing. It's got to be specific and actionable so they know not just that they did something right or wrong, but what they did wrong and how to improve it. And this kind of feedback can come in a variety of different ways. Students can get it from their fellow students, interaction with them. They obviously can get it from a teacher or a research advisor. And to a limited but still some level, they can also just get it from their own self-reflection. So let me talk about then some specific settings. So a research setting, and here I'm thinking of, for example, a PhD student doing research. Now, this is actually the kind of easiest and most natural place for a student to be getting this kind of practice in decision making. And if a student has a reasonable problem that they're called upon and they have some reasonable level of independence and a good advisor, they'll be given the chance to make these decisions and then get feedback from the advisor on how they're doing. And so, like I say, it happens pretty naturally, this is why actually I think most graduate education of working in research under an advisor is quite effective. But I will say it's not automatic, and so here's some advice specifically to graduate students, is that you have to make sure your advisor's being a good advisor. And what that means is, you can be pushy about making sure you actually get practice in making all these decisions instead of only a limited set. And sometimes you need to be kind of pushy, assertive about making sure that your advisor is giving you adequate feedback so you know how well you're doing and where you need to improve. And then also one lesson, it's important for students at all levels, but particularly research students need to learn, is practicing reflection, setting aside times where you really focus specifically on thinking how well you did something, how it could have been actually been done or done better or faster. And so, you know, if you had to do it again, how you can improve. And this is something that people learn pretty slowly, but it's important and beneficial to recognize the need to be quite explicit about doing this. And, you know, big part of that's learning from your mistakes, and so you don't repeat them. And then finally, you just have to recognize you've got to put in the time and effort. You just can't make the changes in your brain without investing this large amount of intense effort. Okay, so let me turn to how then you get this kind of practice in course settings. And the first question is, how much practice of this practice do students actually get in a typical course at making these problem-solving decisions? And the answer is not very much in many cases. You know, sitting listening to a lecture, you're almost never actually thinking how to make decisions that are going on. You're just being told what you should do if you had a situation. Now, usually people give homework problems. You might think that would be better. We've actually studied this and for a number of physics courses, and we were kind of surprised to see how few decisions are actually involved in solving a typical physics homework problem. In introductory courses, we just saw on average 3.3. You'd think more advanced courses might have the students making more decisions. That's not actually what we found. And you can see the average number of decisions was still less than 3 in more advanced undergraduate courses. And the decisions involved are almost always just what are the relevant concepts to use, what calculation to do, and then verifying a solution. Now, this doesn't have to be the case. This is an example where we looked at a research-based project course where students carried out independent projects, and we found there they were having to do many more decisions, and so it was much more valuable. Now, you might wonder, why do this homework and typical exam problems involve so few decisions? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that the problems are quite artificial, and so you've removed a lot of the context and the decisions that are required in any real-world problem. And the problem give all the information and only the information needed to solve the problem. The students are told what assumptions to make, and the problems are very often decomposed, broken down into parts for them. And the problem, you know, I think usually these are because the instructors are trying to sort of make the problems easier for the students. But the reality is that the decisions here, like what information's needed, what assumptions to make, how to break the problem down in parts, these are things that are always sort of automatically part of solving kind of any authentic problem you encounter, and so the things that you really want students to be able to do. And so, you know, I like to make the analogy, this is sort of like, you know, saying, well, I'm going to teach this person how to play the piano, but I'm going to make it easier for them to only use only use one hand. And of course, but to really play the piano, you got to use both hands. So in the same way, you need to give students practice at making all these decisions, and it's hard for them at first, but if they get practice, they learn to do it. Okay, so the other problem with most courses is that there's inadequate feedback. You really need the feedback to students when they work through a problem. It's oftentimes it's much too delayed, but they've forgotten how they were doing on it, and it's not specific enough to help them improve. And this, is just the realities of modern education. This remains sort of a fundamental problem of trying to think how to provide the students with the feedback that's so valuable on their learning. So if you have a course in which you have all these things missing, you might ask, well, they're just hopeless, or are there things you as a student can do to make it better corresponding? And I'm going to go through that, which of course, by the same token, these are things an instructor could build into the course to make it easier for the students to do. So, but there are things a student can do to kind of insert within their regular course environment, even if the instructor's not doing it, how to have additional mental processing and practice decision making. And so, for example, if your material is being presented in course in a lecture, you should be asking yourself regularly, what problem does this solve? What decisions is this material relevant for actually making? How is it used? And you're learning various physics techniques. Think about how these are needed and how they, again, can help make decisions that you need. And when you're working on homework problems, it's always good to think about what are related problems that I've seen before that can help me make sense of this. This is an important decision that experts always do in a new problem. And what are less artificial problems that might involve more decisions, and what would be the decisions needed to solve those problems? And then the other one is to think about what are reasonable assumptions and simplifications, and most importantly, how would you justify those? And if they're already given to you in the problem, as often happens to be the case, then think about how do you justify this as being an appropriate assumption for this problem, and when it might not apply. And similarly, if the problem isn't decomposed into pieces, think very explicitly about how you go about deciding how to decompose it into pieces. And if the problem is broken down into pieces that you're supposed to be solving, think about how did someone decide how to break it down that way. So these are all, the other aspects you can be thinking about is what are most difficult aspects to a solution and why, what are key features to deciding on a solution approach. And this key features I just want to emphasize because this is a well-established expert skill, that experts are just much better than normal people at recognizing what are key things about making decisions and solving problems. What do you need to look for? And this is true if you're, troubleshooting an experiment or picking an approach to solving a theoretical problem. You have to think about, okay, what are the key important features or characteristics that I should use in determining what I need to do? And just to give you an example from a very different field, but sort of makes this point, if you know expert bird watchers, they distinguish these two brown little birds that look to normal person almost identical, but you'll ask, the bird watcher will be able to say, oh, well, that one has that little patch of white behind its left ears, and the other kind doesn't, it's a brown patch, for example. So the key idea here is just recognizing what particular things you would need to focus on that are most useful for solving the problem you're working on. And then another beneficial thing as a student is discussing the material with your peers, because it turns out that process of discussing things or trying to explain things to other people actually triggers a kind of unique cognitive processing in the brain. And this is something that's been well studied, that just trying to think about teaching something to somebody else actually improves the learning compared to spending the same amount of time and effort actually studying it on your own. And it's just because of the funny ways the brain works about social interactions. And so this process of discussing things with peers actually is a way to enhance your learning. And then finally, the last one, I want to particularly emphasize this one because it's done, I think, much too seldom, is this, what I talked about before, of really, just like in the research setting, even in your coursework, practicing stopping to really reflect on what you're doing and how well it's working, and should you go and try some different approach. And we see over and over and over students, particularly novice students, they get locked into just beating their head on a problem, essentially trying the same way. They're very bad at just stopping and saying, okay, this isn't working, what I need to change, how can I do better? So this is something that really is important to practice. Okay, so I've given you all these things to do as a student to make these courses more effective, but this sounds like an awful lot of extra work, right? And the answer is yes, but at some level, that's exactly the point. You know, this is part of deliberate practice, that the brain has to do this extra work involved in deliberate practice really to develop and get better. And so there's really, you know, if you think about the intense mental effort you have to put into learning things, there's just no substitute for it. Okay, now I gave you a long list of things to do, but I'll make sure my lecture notes are available if somebody wants to go and review them. So, okay, so this is things students can do to enhance learning. What about teaching? You know, what is it you can put into a course that builds on this deliberate practice? Well, a lot of it is really just the inverse of what I was just saying for students, but I'll go into a little more detail about this. The first is kind of the question of at what level is this kind of teaching in which you're trying to make deliberate practice of student problem-solving decision built into it. Because, you know, you might, some people might argue, and some people do, that, well, this is maybe good for advanced students, but introductory students, it's not useful for, they just need to learn, memorize a bunch of knowledge, basic facts. Other people would argue, well, it's maybe good for introductory students, but advanced students learn fine with just listening to lectures and learning from it. And I'm going to claim that, in fact, neither of those is true, that this really applies to all levels, and the studies of development of expertise show this, that the development of expertise is very, very much something that just develops continually over time, carrying out the same kind of mental or athletic activities. And we've actually tested this in courses at all different levels, and so I'm actually going to go through giving you examples of applying this with good success and data from 4 different examples here, from Physics 1, the first introductory physics class, all the way to graduate courses. And all of these courses actually have a similar structure to them, which is that the class time is devoted to students spending much of the time actually working through authentic problems, practicing that require them to actually practice making problem-solving decisions. They're doing that, interacting in groups of 3 or 4 students, talking about it and learning, and then reflecting on what they're doing. And there's this student practice activities are then periodically interrupted with feedback from the instructor who's been monitoring sort of how the students are solving problems in their conversation. The instructors then will break in the class into giving them feedback on how they're doing and update them. And the homework is then have a similar practice to it. And these courses are at very different levels, and so the actually topics covered and the decisions that they have to practice and the problems they actually practice solving are then carefully chosen to cover the material and the level that you want the learners to learn, and so that's where the differences are. Now, in these examples I'm going to give you, actually the first one was done directly with these problem solving using the decisions I gave you. The second, third, fourth one predated our research on expert decision making, but still were based on the same basic concept and built around having students practice decisions that the people in these courses knew physicists make. Okay, and so, yeah, here's just an outline of the structure of how the courses work. The students do some basic level of modest preparation before class, then they're given the task, and then they'll work in these small groups on activities while being monitored by the instructor, and then there'll be instructor feedback and additional guidance, sometimes additional information, and then the students will just return on working. Now, in most of the cases I give here, the students are actually completing worksheets, having to write things out on solutions, and some of them, they're in the biggest classes, they're just answering multiple choice questions that are posed by the instructor, and every student has to use some electronics to answer it and talking with their fellow students about those answers. Okay, so the first one is the Physics 1 course, which is taught to students who we had identified were particularly weak high school background in physics. And the focus of this course was really on having them learn to solve real-world problems, and we gave them a problem-solving template where we selected 10 of these problem-solving decisions we thought were particularly appropriate for this level material, and the students would have to work through the problems, answering those decisions as part of solving the problem. And as I say, the format was small groups working together, solving worksheets and getting regular feedback. And the data we got on this was the students who had in the regular course did quite poorly because of their weak preparation, did much better, so there's much reduced dependence on incoming preparation. We measured they got better at their problem-solving skills, and there was a much lower drop in failure rate from this compared to the conventional course. And we also have some data that in subsequent courses they perform better than students who've been taught in the conventional way. The second example is from the Physics 2. This was a very large course, so there were 3 sections of 270 students each, and so we compared the teaching of 2 of these sections, and so in a big lecture hall, bigger than this one, and one of them taught by a traditional lecturer, but good student ratings. One of them, the population was essentially identical, but taught doing this deliberate practice of small group problem-solving decisions and feedback, like I just described. They covered the same material in the same class time, and then they had a joint exam that just covered the material they'd been presented with in class. And here's the comparison of the test scores from the two classes with the histogram. And in blue is the score of the deliberate practice class. In red is the standard lecture class. And so you can see how the whole distribution has moved up. There's substantially more learning from the deliberate practice class. And then this is work done in applying these ideas in a fourth year undergraduate, so modern physics class, but so taught, by fourth year students here. And again, the comparison there was the instructor had taught this class using lecture and then converted this over, taking the key decisions presented in the lecture and having those as part of worksheets that students had to work through, figuring out those on their own, being monitored and feedback by the students. And there's then the measure of this, they had some particularly authentic, challenging exam problems that they compared between the years and see that there's a standard deviation improvement with the deliberate practice teaching approach. And then the final example is one that is actually applying this in sort of one of the most advanced graduate physics courses, quantum field theory. And this wasn't part of a research study, but the same approach was used where thought about, these are now very advanced theory students, and so the course could really focus on what are the decisions and skills needed and used by a functioning theoretical physicist, and built in having students go through practice activities that actually practice making and applying those. And we don't have comparison data, but all the indications from the discussion, the student evaluations were that this was very successful. So, my conclusion here is this deliberate practice of decision based problem solving skills really applies to every level physics course, and that in building it into many courses, you just get a steady improvement in the student expertise of how they think like physicists. And so I'll just finish here and have time for questions. The conclusion is I argue that problem solving is really the essential skill that makes up a good physicist, and you best can learn this by this practice of actually making problem solving decisions in an explicit way. This really develops actually new capabilities in the brain, and it really applies to all the physics educational settings that we have. And so with that, I'll finish. Here's some of my favorite references if you want to learn more about this. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, and now time for questions. Yes.
Thank you for the very nice talk. So I know there's probably no research on this, but it's of course of a lot of current interest to wonder about how this way of thinking is augmented by things like large language models, the existence of things like ChatGPT and BARD and Claude and other things. Do you have any opinions about how that kind of fits into all this? Is it an enabling tool, or is it a disabling tool that makes people weaker in what they do? Thank you.
So that's a very good question, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'll give you a little bit of research and a lot of opinions on it. So on the research side, partly my group is actually exploring how well we can use ChatGPT-4 as an individual tutor to help guide students actually on their practice, making decisions. And we're in the middle of that. It turns out it's challenging because, so from an educational standpoint, these, a good tutor doesn't just give, if it just gives you the answer, that's not very useful. It wants to ask questions, help you. You need to help learn how to figure out on your own and guide you in that direction. These large language models are really built to give answers. And so we're making progress, but it's a big struggle to make them actually work as a good tutor. Now, there's quite a separate question of, goes to the question of, well, what's it mean to be an educated person in the era of AI when you can ask it how to do so many things that we routinely teach students how to do now? And my opinion is that actually these kind of problem-solving decisions are exactly what it's not very good at. And in fact, we've tested that. These decisions are always things made with limited, you might call it insufficient information. And so they're kind of educated guess. They always call on judgment, which large language models, they have lots of training, but they don't have any judgment. And so, I think the artificial intelligence will sort of take over the routine procedural stuff, and really, so we won't need to spend as much time teaching students that. But I think it really, these decision making is going to stay as what's a uniquely important thing to educate students in. And sort of less important is the details of the topics, knowledge we cover.
If the student loses contact with the procedural and the details, will the decision making still be able to function?
There's some level of knowledge that's clearly needed for the students to be good at that, though. Yeah, and it's a little fuzzy about where that is. I think there's another question back.
Yeah. So, one quick question. I mean, a couple of quick questions. So, the first one is about the 29 list of problem-solving decisions that are fundamental to communicate. Is there any gradual number of decisions that should be delivered from the first year to the fifth year, or just like in a class of the first year, you will try to implement all the 29 questions as well as the last year? And the other connected question is, what about the size of the class and the number of professors? So is the same to teach, one professor in a class of 100, 200, or one professor in a class of 30, or you need more professors in one class? So what about this?
Okay, so those are two very different questions. I'll try and remember them. So first, in terms of what decisions are at what level, there's certainly a few of the decisions, like, how important is this in the field? How is this best presented to the field? That are clearly only relevant to very advanced students, okay? Most of the others are, you can see, are actually relevant at almost every level. But I think that it's really kind of an individual judgment call as a teacher, what you think is most important, what you want to emphasize the most at your particular class. I think it's just too much to give all of them, and so you're always going to have to pick out a selected set, but I really think that's much more of except for ruling out a half dozen of them as being, too high level. The others is really much more an individual decision. Let's see, now your second question was about the size of the class. So what we've seen is that these kind of active learning, student involvement things can be done in any size class. They're considerably more difficult to do in an environment like a big lecture theater like this. There's a lot of kind of trickier aspects to get. You're constrained on what you can do. So it does make it more difficult, but it's not impossible. As I gave you the example there, it is being done in 300-person classes quite successfully, but it's certainly more difficult. And if you're going to teach a 300-person class, I would want to kind of introduce these things incrementally, trying little sub things first, compared to if you had a 30 or 40-person class. It's just easier to do a lot more stuff at once. But we have good data showing success, really, at all level size courses.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on this. So I was very impressed by this example of the Physics 2 course. First of all, I was a bit curious how the students were split between the two groups, whether it was just random, if you happen to remember. And the other thing is, in the case where some problem-solving oriented techniques were used, were there instructors? Because for the traditional teaching, of course, you can just fill this classroom and have one lecturer, and that's more or less about it. That's sufficient if you have very limited resources. But how much can you do with just one lecturer without instructors, without tutors and so on, for let's say a fairly large class in this approach?
So again, what we've seen is that one instructor in a large class can do a lot of these things. We certainly found it works better when, and in fact, I think in that 270-person class, there was about one teaching assistant for every 50 students, and those teaching assistants would sort of circulate around it wasn't a big lecture theater, but circulate around and sort of be helping out, and that certainly makes it easier, okay? I've seen, and I would hesitate to predict you could get as good a result if it was just a single professor, but I do have examples where a single professor certainly does make it still significantly better, even by themselves.
My turn, I think. Yeah. Hi, thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. So I was wondering, you started at the beginning saying that this problem-solving issue is, or thing is common to different aspects of knowledge, like music, sports. And then you say that it's a nice thing to dilute this in every course. But do you think, we don't have this here, do you think it would be good for students to have like a generic course on problem solving, like an independent course? Because I know for a fact that in some US universities you have courses like orders of magnitude physics or street fighting mathematics and these kind of things. So do you think for physicists it would be great in the first year or whenever to have a dedicated problem solving course?
So the answer to that is I don't know. What I do know is there are some times where people have generic, what they call problem-solving courses. They're actually critical thinking courses where they supposedly teach students to think about how to make decisions. Those don't work. And I'll say why those don't work. And it's just because we see that you need to use these decisions across all these different fields, but actually learning to make those decisions, you always have to call on information. And so when you try and teach something that's kind of information free, it just doesn't work because people have to learn how to call on information to make them work. So that's if you try to teach it for all college students. Now, if you wanted to teach it for just physics students, that's a different question. And it's one in which we're sort of exploring right now, because we're teaching this Physics 1 course, which we have a very big emphasis, explicit emphasis on problem solving. And the question is, will that carry forward to students using those approaches later on? We have anecdotal information of a number of students from that course coming back and telling us, hey, this is really useful. I'm using it in my later physics courses or engineering courses using that problem-solving approach. And so, but like I say, those are individual anecdotes. Those aren't real serious data. And so what the research says, it leaves it kind of up in the air, actually. If you started out teaching them that, would it carry forward? I'm just not sure if it would transfer or not. Okay. I have an awful big concentration of questions from this part of the room. Do we have other parts of the room?
Okay. I ask you something related to my experience since I teach first and second year physics at engineers. I see that I also give problems that I break down because when I try to make them more complex, the results are quite bad. And I understand that I could teach to solve more deep, in depth, if I had more time. Because, you say that it takes a lot of effort, and I understand, but it also takes a lot of time, and students have finite amount of time. So often I see that if I can explain something better, more in depth, then I end up doing less, and we are required to cover quite a large material. So I'm asking what is your thinking about the struggle between these two things?
It's always a struggle in that if you had more instructor time and more student time, people would learn more. But what we've seen, and we've worked with transforming a large number of science courses to this kind of active learning things that I've talked about. What we've seen is that it's important that people do have to think carefully about how to optimize the use of time. But if they do, there's considerable variation, but people in general, I guess, the most typical is people find they can cover maybe 90% of what they were covering in the lecture course. They can still cover in this approach, but that the students learn substantially more. In fact, on that Physics 2 example I gave, in the experimental course, they actually didn't cover one of the 11 topics, but the students still, on the question on the test, on that topic, the students still outperformed the students in the lecture course. So, yeah, I mean, it is always a trade-off, but if people think carefully about how you can cover almost as much material, I would say, but probably not quite as much. But coming back to the decomposing the problem into parts, what we see is, yeah, it makes it, the students can do better if the problems are broken down that way. But if they're tested then on a problem that isn't broken down that way, they do terrible on it, and real world problems aren't broken down that way. So it's sort of a thing you really just have to help them learn how to do it.
Okay, I have two questions. First of all, to develop the deliberate practices, you have designed some activities, I thought. So have you used a backward design or a forward design approach? And secondly, you have shown us some marvelous result of your comparison between standard teaching and deliberate practice teaching based. And so how you design your test to be, let's say, unbiased?
Okay, so let me go with the unbiased test first. So you know, the way we and others do this is sometimes one has these sort of separate tests of the material that are developed by physics education researchers and sort of carefully validated and so on that you can give to students before and after the class and get comparisons. And so that's one way people do it. In the test, the examples that I showed you here, where we had really just tests developed by the instructors, in the one Physics 2 example, it was, you know, they had the two instructors had agreed upon a set of learning objectives that they were going to cover. The test questions were jointly developed by the two instructors to directly address those specific learning objectives. And so it seems pretty, you know, that seems like a pretty objective way to do it. And the other one for the advanced course, that was just a judgment call by the instructors that they had these, you know, they taught the course for several years. They had a couple of exam questions that they thought were particularly good because they were quite authentic, you know, things like a real physicist would be encountering in the lab, and that they knew students had always found them. First, they thought they were good and authentic, but they also knew students always found them challenging, and so they just chose those as a set of problems to give as a comparison. So I think you were talking about the design of these things. I mean, yeah. At some level, it's sort of backward design. People, I mean, the idea is you think about, okay, what's the topics you want students to learn and what's the things you want them to be able to do, what are the decisions you want them to do on what kind of problems, and then you work backwards to design your activities to give the practice of those. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for wonderful, interesting talk. About this problem-solving approach, after this, session of decision, problem-solving decision, do you think it's good to have also a part of the examination that, build up for a final grade to the students, or the final exam unique and say related to the whole project, whole course will be preferable? And as you see, the impact of the web-based tools that goes all the way from the mock courses up to WooClap, okay, be effective in teaching physics, or is more a distraction?
So I got the question about the exam. Let me answer that, and then I didn't quite sure what you were asking the second. We'll come back to that. So, okay, so exams are, I look at them as a pretty arbitrary thing. And, you know, my own experience doing research with exams, I get more and more skeptical, because the more I give exams and then I do follow-up interviews and things with students and realize how my exams really aren't revealing, aren't really that great at telling, it's really telling what students know and don't know, and that's just kind of a limitation of exams. But I've also come to, largely based on that, believe that the exams shouldn't ever be a surprise to students, that you should have them doing certain kinds of problems in class and in homework, and the exams ought to look very much like the kinds of problems they've already seen, and so that it's sort of not an unexpected surprise, and that that's the most likely way to get a valid measure with the exams. And so what that means when you're teaching students problem solving is on the exams, you're giving them things where they have to make problem solving decisions and justify them as part of the exam. And now that usually takes more writing and time, so you have to kind of adjust timing of things to fit that in. But I think it's what you care about, measuring if they can do that thinking, and you want to put it on your exams to measure it. So now, okay, your second question?
Yeah, it was on the effective role of the, say, web-based tools that goes from the MOOC courses
okay,
to
so
even, say, asking the students with the WOO Club, the things, you know, you vote online.
Yeah, so there's tons of web-based things and homework problems and hints and things like that. And I'm not sure about the effectiveness of them, but I remain a bit skeptical. I think in many cases they're just kind of oversimplified in terms of what hints and help they give students, and so that it's probably not very effective. But you know, there's certainly an awful lot of stuff one's using these days, and it would be nice if we had more data on actually what was really effective and what wasn't, but I think it's pretty limited. So, yes, way up and back.
Thank you. Thank you for your lesson, and excuse me for my English, but you showed us a very systematic approach. What is the role in your approach of creativity, inspiration, and the ability to look at what is unexpected, the so-called serendipity?
Yeah, so let me skip inspiration, because that's kind of hard, but I can talk about creativity a little bit. You know, I've thought about this and what scientific creativity is, and I think in my own research, I've done some things that people would say are pretty creative, and so it's kind of used as a model. And, you know, I think being at some level, all scientists, all physicists are creative in their activities, because creativity, I would argue, in a scientific sense, is really thinking about something in a different way. And in a scientific way, it's thinking about something in a different way that allows you to solve some problem that people care about. And so it both is as this aspect of being a unique, different way of thinking about it, but it's also useful for something. Otherwise, in science, it's not, you know, we don't care about it. And so when you think about doing things in a different way, I mean, an awful lot of what scientists, you know, physicists do in their normal work is almost always thinking about something in somewhat different way, you know, and so that's what I'm saying. They're always creative if they're doing something different, as they all are. And the more creative is kind of the bigger the differences and the more significance that those differences have. And so that's sort of what I'd say scientific creativity is. Now, the teaching of it is a really problematic issue, because I would say that most of our teaching, and I admit even most of my teaching, is kind of anti-creative, because it's really, the students are working on problems where their goal is to get the answer that the instructor is looking for. And so that's exactly not thinking about different from other people. And so it's sort of anti-creative. And I think, you know, the best in it, you know, so teaching creativity is to really to think of problems which don't have a single right answer, and there are different ways to think about it, and so that students have this opportunity to practice thinking in different ways. But because, you know, it's just a hard thing to teach. It's a hard thing to have happen. It's much more suited to things like project courses, where the student is choosing what the project's on and has the opportunity to kind of make their own decisions and having think about things in different ways. But anyway, and of course in research it comes out too. But it's a hard thing to think how to teach in a regular course, to be honest. Although it's not impossible. I've seen people do clever things that allow students to come up with kind of completely novel solutions. And in one research case we looked at, it made a big difference on students actually in their future work, and how novel they were coming up with good novel solutions to a problem. So.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about like the beginning part of your presentation. You listed a few ways in which students with traditional course, with any traditional course, they can take that experience and improve their experience doing it by themselves. But I'm wondering, like, how could you have students know how to improve this experience? Like, would you give this list to students? Would that be a solution before they take a traditional course to improve their own experience, or?
That's what I'm trying with this talk.
But like before, would it just be listed like this in the beginning of a traditional course?
I mean, ideally you'd have the instructors building these things in, but without that, I mean, the hope is that at least giving students this advice of these kind of added things they can be thinking about would be beneficial. But, this is just me at this level speculating and hoping on that. I mean, but I should say that it's not so crazy. I mean, I think, lots of physicists grow up going to lectures and they still turned out reasonably well. They might have turned out better, more successful if they'd had better teaching, but they still gain quite a bit from those courses. And I think most of that's because they are doing additional sort of thinking. They aren't just passively listening to lectures in many cases. They're actually doing some of these things of processing when looking at homework problems, sort of extrapolating beyond that, and that's allowing them to be successful ultimately. So it's not crazy that people can do this on their own.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because I've taken a fair share of traditional physics courses in my education, but I kind of wish that I would have had a list like this in the beginning, so I would make the most of my
Right, yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's probably helpful. But.
I have a question that's maybe related. So what does good actionable feedback look like? And what type of feedback do students get for the homework problem? Because the teacher is not there when they are solving those problems.
Yeah, so first on homework problems, I mean, what I would say is we've done a little research on this, and I know some others have too, is that the feedback, well, first, students pay almost no attention to the feedback on homework problems. They just mostly look at the score they got and are happy or unhappy, and they don't really do much else with it. I think one of the reasons they don't do much with it, and it's one of the weaknesses of the feedback they get on homework, is it's too delayed, and so they don't really even remember what they were thinking about. Good feedback needs to be timely so that you still remember what you were doing. If you want to learn to play tennis, you don't go hit a tennis balls and then come back a week later and the teacher tells you you were doing something wrong. You hit a tennis ball and then they tell you right away how you can change. And so this lack of timeliness, and also just knowing a score, isn't very useful, because it needs to be timely while you still remember what you were doing. It needs to be specific, sort of, exactly what you can tell. And one of the things that I've learned from cognitive psychologists is the negative feedback is actually the most useful. So, you might learn a little bit from doing something and being told, oh, good, you got that, you did that right. You learn a lot more when you do something wrong and you learn what you did wrong and what you need to do to improve that. So one of the things that means, though, is that, negative feedback can be unpleasant for people, and so it has to be delivered in a way that the people receive that as though this is to be helpful to me rather than just make me feel bad and telling me I'm stupid. And so that's sort of what good feedback needs to have. But it's a real problem with homework. Now, what I'll tell you that we've found that is of some value is on exams and sometimes homework, having where students can get some of the points back that they missed by turning in revisions where they have to explain what they did wrong and what was thinking about what was wrong about their thinking, and so how to improve it. And they get points back for that. One of the values of that is that really encourages them to go back and look carefully at what the solution was, look carefully at what they did, and therefore, and that's really the value then of, they get value from that kind of feedback, much more so than just getting a score. There's a question up here.
Thank you very much for impressive lecture. I have maybe a little bit a naive question. To make any decision, you need already educational background. You mentioned this, that you should have some kind of expertise to make any decision. And how would you suggest to provide this educational background?
So this is actually a surprisingly tricky question of when you give people knowledge, under what conditions. And so what I would say is there's sometimes sort of just basic knowledge and information, and that is oftentimes most effective just by having a, read the textbook or maybe look at some video short thing before class. But there's also other data and studies that have shown that people learn a lot more if they try and solve a problem first that they don't know enough to solve, but they get engaged with it, of thinking about it and what they need to know, and then they're given the information on how to solve it. This is called sort of just-in-time teaching or preparation for future learning. And so a lot of that can take place in a class like this where the students might start working on a problem where they don't have enough knowledge to solve it, and they'll realize they don't know certain things. And then the instructor, kind of as part of this feedback and follow-up, will then give them that knowledge that they need, and then they can go back and apply it. So, I would say the research says the most effective way is kind of getting them, you have to give them problems that they can start being engaged in thinking about, but probably can't be completely successful in solving them, but then follow up very quickly with providing them the knowledge as needed, and then they get a chance to use that knowledge.
I feel like that is very stimulating, and I wonder if there are resources of example of this, like a repository of recorded lectures on different type of courses in which this approach is applied, and so we can learn from the examples.
So if you look, let's see, I guess, I don't have it listed here anymore. I always used to put it in. We did some work that, if you go to the CWSEI, It was an initiative I ran at University of British Columbia on changing teaching, and it has a website. If you just, CW,
I can share it through our secretary.
Carl Wieman Science Education Initiative. If you go do a search on that, it brings up the website, which has a bunch of videos, actually, of some films, in particularly large classes, using some of these methods. And then it also has guidance for instructors, where it has a whole bunch of sort of 1- and 2-page documents on how to do specific teaching activities in a class like this that give you. So that's probably one of the best resources I can think of. Yeah, it does have the course materials for some of these things, so yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I'd like to ask a different question in particular. Is there any guide or any of these ideas that may apply to outreach? Thank you.
To what was the last word?
Outreach activities, outreaching.
Outreach.
Sorry, my Spanish pronunciation.
Yeah. I'm going to plead ignorance on that. I just don't know enough about research on outreach to be able to say with any confidence. I'd say that, the basic principles apply pretty broadly, but outreach has sort of some different goals often than exactly what I'm talking about, and so I'm just not sure how directly it would be. Okay, maybe last question, or this has been a lot. There's one up very, way up in the back.
As a student, I really like this approach, but I can also imagine it being frustrating at times or demoralizing, running into problems that you just aren't quite able to solve. How do you keep students motivated in a process like this?
Yeah, so motivation is really critical, and what I'd say is, so the research on motivation says there are a couple of things that are important, and I mean, one of the things it says, it depends a lot on people's individual background and experiences, and those vary, and so it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all that works for everybody. But we know that presenting material in sort of a meaningful way that the students can see is sort of relevant to their lives and that might be useful to them is one thing that's important. And and a lot of abstract physics things, it takes a little thought to think how to put it in a relevant context, but you can almost any time you can do that with a little effort. So that's one thing, is just how to present the material. Another thing is, it's important for motivation to have the learner both recognize that they can learn the material and how to go about learning it. And if the learner sort of has that sense, and they have a sense as they're working through things that they're actually learning and accomplishing things, that's really quite motivating. And so as a teacher, it's important to have things that they do and things you can show off that, gee, look at how much you're learning now. Look at the things you can do now that you didn't know how to do before. And so that's sort of another important aspect of motivation. Seems like I'm missing something, but I'm blanking on it right now. So.
Okay, it's okay. So I think it's time to thank our speaker again. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, if you have any further questions or thoughts or points you would like to bring to discussion, you can take this QR code and I can send a link directly. Because tomorrow afternoon we will have like a smaller meeting, a focus group with some of you actually, I don't know if you are all here, some instructors, and not only from the physics department, and there's still a few places, so if any of you would really like to participate, can come here after the talk and we can see if they can join, where we will try to discuss these things more in depth. So you can take the QR code and it will be active also after the talk, through the night and tomorrow, yeah, if you have any further questions. And through that platform, you can also endorse others' questions, so not to repeat the same question several times, so we can see what questions are more relevant to this audience and try to focus the discussion on, maybe on our context. That's all?
Well,
yeah?
Oftentimes people want to see copies of my slides, so I'll give them to Marta and she can post them somewhere where you
absolutely, yes. Okay. So thank you again for joining us today. Have a nice evening.